Welcome to Creative in Tech, a podcast show powered by ReadSpeaker.ai. I'm your host, Carrie Roberts, and I'm the brand evangelist for North America at ReadSpeaker. And this show is all about highlighting the various brands, people, and organizations that are creatively using one of the fastest growing spaces in technology, artificial intelligence, including things like conversational AI, voice technology, and more. And today's conversation is part of our leadership series. And I am so excited. We are going to be talking a little bit about how to recognize and undo bias in AI. And I am joined today by LaTonya Pegues. She is an unconscious bias trainer. But before that, she worked in the aerospace industry in a variety of positions. So she did things like working with satellite and missions engineers, low temperature physics researcher, and communications and PR. Now she's consulting organizations on how to undo bias and a lot in the tech space as well. Welcome, LaTonya. Excited to have you here.
Hi, Carrie. How are you?
I am good. I'm so excited we got to make this happen.
Me too.
We met at a another voice event and had connected. And I, like you said, you kind of worked in the aerospace industry and then you kind of get into this kind of consulting and training. Can you tell us a little bit about what had you think about doing that transition from one thing to the other?
Well, it was an issue, really. It's like, I discovered, well, first of all, thank you for having me. And hello, those who are listening and viewing. But it was just really an incredible experience to realize that the tech was always going to get fixed, but the people challenges just seem to never really move forward sometimes. So it's like, well, people had told me I'm a pretty good communicator, so I appreciate that, of course. But I'm like, let's take some of these skills that are transferable and try to help the people who are working on the tech.
Yes. No, I agree. I think a lot of times people think of AI as like robots are going to take over the world, but there's so much human pieces that go into creating all of this technology. So I want to talk about the term unconscious bias. What does that mean to you and why do we have it? Is it something we all have?
Well, unconscious bias, Carrie, it's just really just things that happen to us that when we were growing up or things that we've experienced. And as a result of that, there's social stereotypes about certain groups of people or individuals that are just different from our own. So they're just they're stereotypes based on our life experiences. Now, sometimes they're right on point and sometimes they're not. But in that, with that being said, everybody has bias. I'm wearing this color today, you're wearing that color today. All bias isn't negative, but there are times when bias can become very negative. But just to let you know, sometimes bias gets a bad rap, but all bias isn't bad. But basically it's just, how our grandparents raised us, what we experienced growing up in school, the news media, our friends, whatever is influencing us, that's what causes us to have the biases that we have.
Yeah. And like you said, we all have them and sometimes we're not aware of them because it does come from our past experiences or our culture or the people we're around. So I think it's good to kind of start there. Now, when we're kind of talking again about the artificial intelligence world, especially conversational AI, what have you been noticing maybe in the conversational AI space in terms of where you are seeing bias? Can you maybe give us some examples?
Oh, sure. So these, like you were just talking about the AI bots, the AI bots and the voice assistants, they are reinforcing gender bias, for example. I think I saw a statistic recently that 94% of the voices are ladies, which of course is okay, but we want more, representation in that regard. And then also, previous studies have shown that AI systems, the facial recognition part, so it's not only the voice, but it's also the face. So you're like, does that face really sound like that voice or vice versa? And then even Amazon, Apple, Google, IBM, and Microsoft, they have a challenge transcribing those voice bots, transcribing certain ethnic voices. For example, an African American's voice versus a white person's voice with AI voice recognition. So it's these bots and speech recognition and Alexa voices, and Siri and Quran, all these different ones that are actually trying to interpret what's being said. And sometimes, I don't know if you know people who speak languages that don't sound exactly, how their accent isn't exactly like, Siri or somebody would understand, but it can be very frustrating where you're just trying to say, open my mail. So that's certainly, a bias that that can be very frustrating with people who have an accent that's different than what's being recognized.
Yeah, I like that. Like you said, it's not just the voices we're hearing, it's the faces, and it's also that how we're being recognized with our own voice than transcription or the ASR, which I didn't think about it till you said it. I think it's smart because you're right. Even if we think of English, in the US, how many people speak with different accents, regionally, in the Northeast versus the South versus the Midwest, everyone has a different accent. And can that person be understood? And are they being represented with the use of AI? Is that kind of what you mean when you speak of that part?
Absolutely. And that's just before we even leave our shores here in the continental US.
Yes.
So yes, most certainly, so this voice thing is very serious. And it really is interesting because we're talking about communication, so if we're not able to find a way, those of us who are designing and programming and, creating the opportunity to be inclusive at this level, that could really start to disenfranchise and marginalize other people 10, 20 years down the road. So this really is an important topic. And I really appreciate you sharing about this today.
Yeah, I want to start with, we talked about we all have some sort of unconscious bias. So how do we start to recognize our own bias in general?
Well, if you don't mind, I just want to say just real quickly though, but what causes the negative bias? If we can is that okay if we just backtrack a little bit on that?
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the things is wrong information, Carrie. Sometimes people just love to hear certain things, or they just get in what I call a bias bubble, and then they're just stuck in that area, and they're not able to get a flow of different ideas and etc. And then also sometimes they don't even have all the information. Sometimes people are in such a hurry, I call it a hurry bias. It's like, okay, wait a minute. You don't have all the information. Why are you trying to make a decision based on just this little bit? And we have all this to go, So those of you who are listening and not watching, I did my fingers in a little small space and I did a big gap space just so you know what's happening. And then also, I used to be a radio announcer, so I know you got to think, people who aren't watching, but are able to see. But also another one, this is the big one, just limited perspective on an issue. So like you had mentioned in the opening, I have a background in low temperature physics and satellite engineering. I've worked on spacecraft that are literally orbiting the Earth as we speak, and, well-recognized places I've worked. But yet and still, if somebody's going to try, I've had experience. I'm not the best in the world. I don't know it all, but I come with experience. So if someone else is coming, who maybe just saw a whole bunch of programs on TV or something like that, and they're going to try to tell me how to do, it's like, wait a minute. You have a limited perspective on this issue. So how can you try to tell me, a subject matter expert, and that compared to them, what the situation is. So sometimes people's egos get in the way and they get their feelings hurt, but that's an example. And just a couple more, not hearing all sides of an issue. So when we were kids, sometimes, your friends might have been accusing you of doing something. And you're like, what? But wait a minute, they didn't tell you what they did. So that happens too as adults. Sometimes we don't want to admit when we're wrong and that we have the problem. And so it's good, I say, to bring everybody together in the situation to the solution so you can hear all sides. And usually when that happens, the truth kind of rises up a lot quicker. And then another one is, this is important. Someone that you admire is done wrong. So if you have a celebrity crush, or if you have a favorite person or somebody who you just adore, sometimes our biases just keep us from even just being able to believe that that person is even possible of doing something wrong. But if you look at the video or, whatever evidence there may be, sometimes your bias is so strong, you can't even see it. And then of course, there's just the good old fashioned, you just don't want to know the truth.
Yeah, I think those are really good points. I actually, the third one you gave about if someone you admire, and I'm not even going to say celebrities, I think, parents or a boss, just someone or a spouse that you care about, and maybe they say something that you're like, wait, I don't know if that's true, or I don't know if I agree with that, but I care about them and I've admired them. I think that's probably a really hard one, I would assume, for people to be aware of, let alone adjust.
Yeah, it's really something, because it really goes back to our memory, like in our brain with the hippocampus and the amygdala, and we're going way back. I'm just going to talk a little brain science just for a quick moment. Don't turn us off. Keep us on. We love this programming. But what happens when we experience things, whether it's happy thoughts, a traumatic event, or just something that makes you go, what? All these things are stored in our brain. And then sometimes when we're under pressure or if things are happening where we're like, whoa, what's going on here? And then like somebody calls it a trigger, you're triggered in that moment. And as a result of that, that brings out this like, whoa, where did that come from? But something that happened in our past is bringing that out. And that happens in voice tech. when people are creating tech, when they're creating these different algorithms, etc., those types of experiences are just ramming right through, and they don't even realize that they're creating systems that are inequitable, not really just and fair. There's a lot of discrimination that goes in to some of these thoughts and the things that are being programmed and designed. But I don't think that the programmers are like, I am a racist white male and I'm going to make the world terrible for everybody with all my bias. I'm going to program it right here. No, these are unconscious bias things, so even with the whole Black Lives Matter movement and George Floyd's murder and different things that have just been horrible for African Americans throughout the history of the United States, but some people didn't experience it. So that's another thing I say sometimes, Carrie, too, is no experience can lead to bias. And I was on some kind of webinar or something the other day, and we're talking bias, so we got to talk colors sometimes. And this white lady is like, oh, we just never knew, all these things were happening. And because we're talking about entertainment industry and the bias there. And I just looked at her and I'm like, well, I'm an African-American woman and we've known about these things forever. She was so embarrassed, but I'm like, but her perspective is changing. Now she's not back, but she's in a place where now she's experiencing certain things and learning about different things, so there's all these different ways of what we've experienced in life and how it affects us in everything that we do.
Yes, I 100% agree. And I think, you and I spoke prior to this about the need for having a mix of people on a team. It really starts there. Can you talk about the importance of that? And kind of, again, how do we start to kind of undo this in terms of the workplace and maybe in tech specifically, since that's where we focus?
Okay, what was the first part of your question?
Just a little bit about how we can try to have more of a mix of people that are working on some of this technology and the importance of that.
Got it. Yeah. So, the thing about it is you got to get outside your bias bubble. So how can you asked me earlier, how do you know when your bias is showing? Every part of your life is the same. You don't have any friends that think different than you do. Maybe you are innovating a little bit. But, the thing about it is, especially with the smart people, those of us who are doing the tech stuff, we're told we're the best, we're the brightest, but sometimes we're in these little tiny bubbles and we are just there. So, for example, some companies you go to, it seems like everybody went to the same university. And not only the same university, Carrie, but the same department. So when you have someone a company that has been educated in one place, that's probably not a great place to go for different ideas and different ways of thinking and different approaches. My God, and some people are all from the same neighborhood, and you're like, wow, if you think about your favorite meal that you eat every day, I don't think you want to eat that meal every single day. You want something different, a variety. And so that also applies to, where we're being educated, how we're being educated, what we're learning, and what we're taking with us. So can you imagine if we had a professor who was just way off the deep end with a ton of negative bias, and that person becomes the dean and the chair of the department and then the president of that company, at the university, all that just trickles down into everything that happens at that institution of higher learning. And so again, transform and translates that into companies, and there you have it. So that is a really good example. And I can't tell you how many times I've experienced it. Like, did everybody here go to the same school and the same major? What? So the innovation is affected because people are always thinking the same thing, this group think. Well, you know how we did it here. You know how we did it there. It's like, the world is definitely bigger than just one department.
Well, I like that example because I think, you and I talked about this before too, this diversity of thought. It's not just about different genders or different ethnicities, but it could be about different universities or different spaces. I say all the time, one of the things I love about voice technology is a lot of creative people have come into this space, myself included. We're not technologists by trade, but there's that offers another level of innovation when you have people that are in the arts and the value that they bring. And so really thinking about, okay, how do I add this to my team? But I think one of the questions people have is, if you have maybe too many different ways of thinking or too many different ways or with people, can you come to a consensus? Can there be something that can be done and done well and done fast enough, especially when tech and business are moving so quickly?
Well, it's all relative, to use an Einstein term. If the culture is there, if people are flexible, if they're willing to learn, if they're interested in doing something different, say, for example, in sports, hey, that's always changing if you're in a game, right? If there's 1 minute left and the score is tied, people are going to be pretty creative and figure out a way on how to win that game. So I would say that also potentially could apply to the workplace too. So yes, things are changing. Oh my goodness. You and I are communicating via voice over IP, and we're glad about that. But some people want to be in person, but we had to pivot. We had to find a way to make it work. And I think we're doing a pretty successful job at it. What do you all think who are listening and watching? Are we doing all right? We're doing all right.
I agree. It is about pivoting, trying, being open. Like you said, sometimes that can be challenging if we've been thinking one way for a long time. But I personally love talking to a variety of people because sometimes someone says something in a different way and it makes you think differently and move forward, which is good. So, how do we, any other steps of how we can not only, we've recognized it, but now how do we kind of undo some of this? Are there any, besides bringing people in, if I'm always thinking a certain way, what are steps that I can actionably take to start improving the biases that I may have? I mean, we may not want to change all of them. Like you said, some of them are good, but what are maybe some actionable tips that we can do for ourselves?
Well, I think the first one is being self-aware. Are you willing to change? Do you feel like you know everything? Are you willing to say, you know what? We are not doing this right. We've been making some mistakes along the way. And I know in tech, they love to say fail fast, fail often. So is this a failure? Admit it. It's like, it doesn't mean you're a bad person, but thankfully, you're at a place where you can, I say, come out of denial and potentially realize the fact, you know what? It was me. Like the Shaggy song, he says, it wasn't me, but it was Shaggy. He was guilty. Well, he was doing what he said he wasn't doing.
Yes, like yes.
And so, the same thing applies. We're educated people. We've gone through, different things in life. We played some sports and won some games and lost some games. So it's okay to admit, even if you've gotten, $1 billion in funding and you got this wonderful startup and everything needs to pivot because it was just founded, in some ways that were not the best. It's okay. Be willing to change. And also, I would say, Carrie, be willing to unlearn areas where you just totally missed it. I think one of the things that came out of this last year and a half or so, since 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, is that people in the United States started learning real American history that wasn't what they experienced when they were growing up. Unfortunately, there's a lot of cancel culture in the education system. A lot of African American culture is just not included at all in the education. Okay, slavery. But that's not really a major well, of course, we built this country for free. But I mean, as far as just, there's so much more that our people have contributed to this country. And I have to say, since we're talking about voice and tech, Dr. Shirley Ann Jackson is a wonderful woman. She's still with us, has done incredible research, wonderful inventions. And who of you, including me, ever gets a phone call and never looks to see who's calling you? Do you recognize the number? Have you saved it in your contacts? Probably. But that is an African American woman whose presence is felt in our hands every day with our phones. We're talking amazing. Caller ID, her invention too. So once you start learning and unlearning and relearning some areas and thinking about intentionally being inclusive, you will realize that people who you thought were not necessarily valuable, who've been underserved, are making incredible impacts in our lives every single day. And then after you've come out of denial and you're like willing to realize, there's some areas that we can do a whole lot better, be flexible. It's not going to just happen like this. Again, when you are at the finish line and you're trying to win that game or whatever sport you're into, it's like you got to figure out something quick and be curious. Just don't say, okay, we've always done it this way, but we'll try a little bit different. No, be curious, be courageous, and most importantly, just be willing to change. And then you got to listen for different voices too. So if everyone in your department is from your same university, it's probably time to start doing some partnerships with other groups and organizations that are not from your same school of thought.
Yeah, I agree. I think you said it wonderfully. Again, being open, being curious is such a big part of all of it. If we're talking about being innovative in tech, it's also about how do we think and the people we interact with and our own education. In the voice technology space for us, we create a lot of synthetic voices. In voice technology, it's in terms of like the voice that speaks back to you, which is one of the things you had mentioned earlier on. With the start of voice assistants, we think of Siri, it's a white female. We have Alexa, white female, and then Google Assistant is kind of a white female. And a lot of these, we kind of seem the same thing. And then a lot of females have said, why does it have to be a female? Like, why does it have to be a female assistant? And then there's this idea of, why is it only a white person? There are so many voices that need to be represented.
Why is it usually a British accent?
So can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on this, on the industry as a whole, and the importance of having a variety of voices speak back to you?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting. That's a very good question for a lot of reasons. One is I think that, this might sound a little strange, I'm about to say, but if people can find a way to make money on something, they seem to find a way to figure out how to do it better. So if this inclusion of different voices and getting rid of this negative bias and not being inclusive, it's such a potential, once it's figured out, to really explode as far as opportunities is the way that I view it. So if I say, for example, if I'm just flipping through television and I see someone that looks like me and resonates with me, I'm going to stop and watch that program. So the same thing applies to voice. Personally, I just tune out of certain things if I don't hear a voice that is relatable to me, or if it's something that I'm not even interested in. So my goodness, if they can find a way, and of course they can, because if they want to, they'll do it, to be more inclusive, and whatever they're selling will probably sell more. And sometimes people say, well, LaTonya, we just don't even know where to start. I said, okay, get a map of the world out and just pick and choose from each continent. Of course, all nations are not the same. I get it. But just start from the continental level. Start with, just different continents and the different people groups that are there. Start with those voices. Of course, there are many dialects, tons of accents. I get it. But that is a great way just to start your inclusion point, jump off, if you will, of just looking at the map and looking at the world and saying, okay, well, let's get, something that's representative of this area. Now, I get it. There's a ton of them per country. I understand that. But as far as you programmers out there and developers who are like, data scientists, oh, what do we do? Just start there. It's something very simple. And most of you may have actually traveled to another nation. So maybe even consider that. It's like, oh, let's use our lived experience from when we were in another place, and let's start thinking in that regard as we're working on our next project.
Yeah, I like that. And it's interesting you were talking about, again, representation. So I did a virtual reality game the other day for the first time, and it was boxing, and it was all men. And the first thing that popped out of my mouth was, "We're the women." And I was like, why is there not a female boxer on this? And I was kind of annoyed. And they were like, oh, the game wasn't made that way. I was like, well, why not? It was like an immediate thing of feeling like not being represented. Yet on the other side, sometimes when you always hear a female voice, it's this assumption that, well, that's how all females are, that all females might like this, and we're all different, So I understand what you're saying just from my own personal point of view. When a brand is looking at, okay, we want to be able to reach an audience, we want an ROI, we want all of this, and they're trying to decide which type of voices to use, do you have any suggestions for that? If they say, well, our studies show it should be a female, it should be this. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I would say, what studies? How inclusive are your studies? I'm a scientist. I've been in the lab, and I know that if you only look at one area and don't delineate or even disaggregate or reaggregate, mix and mingle with a little jingle, you're going to get what you want. So there are ways to change your research there are ways to be more inclusive even in that, so it's this thing of, again, be courageous, be flexible, be willing to change, if you just think about it, just think about who are the people that you interact with before the pandemic, if you're not, going out these days. But, just think about your circle of friends. Think about the type of food that you drink. Are you a creature of habit? Are you even willing to try something different? And if not, then that might give you an indicator as to where you are as far as maybe your willingness to try something different. But now that we've gone through all these iterations of the variants, and of course they're still raging, unfortunately, and I pray that everybody's okay out there. And I'm sorry for anyone's loss who's experienced loss as a result of COVID-19. But there are ways that we can be more innovative. And I know that I am more connected with the world now. And I'm an international person. I've been to at least 5 of the 7 continents myself before the pandemic, but there's just something about stretching and trying something new and listening to new perspectives that really can make us better. And so as you are going and looking at your research and deciding, okay, well, let's try something different. The voices, I'm telling you, it's really going to be a great way to, I would say, this is me speaking. This is not Carrie. This is not ReadSpeaker.ai. This is LaTonya Pegues. It is really going to have a major impact on your bottom line. The more inclusive voices, the ethnic sounding voices, not just the, like the Valley Girl. And I used to live in California, so I can talk about the Valley Girls. I know what they sound like. And some people say, I sound like a Valley Girl. But anyway, so... there are ways to be more inclusive if you can't figure it out. Different ranges, different tones and textures of voice. There's so much here, and I don't want to take up too much of our time just talking about that. But there's a wide variety that you can do, and be courageous. You can do it. And the thing about it is that your audience is going to recognize it, and they probably will enjoy it. And if they don't, guess what? You're probably missing out on like maybe a huge percentage of the market anyway. So when you change and pivot and become more inclusive in your voice and your descriptions, and even what you're doing, maybe even with the graphics, that's another important thing. You should definitely have people who actually look like they are from a different nation. Now, I'm talking unconscious bias here, so I have to just dig a little deep. Now, if I'm looking at somebody, sometimes you can kind of wonder, it's like, I wonder where that person's from. And other times, you're like, okay, I probably know where that person's from. So the same approach, in my opinion, should be taken to diversifying what you're doing with the voice. Don't be like, some of them you might need that Midwestern sound, as they say, But others, it's like, oh no, I know. Okay. So say, for example, if you're looking at somebody who's an African American or Hispanic, or somebody who's, I don't know, from an Asian nation. Sometimes I'm not, please don't be offended. But sometimes with a quick look, you can have an idea of where that person is from. Now, what I have noticed is that a lot of brands are actually starting to lighten the tone. They're starting to kind of, some would say, even whitewash, this whole idea of colorism, like, what is it? What, you have a problem with showing people who actually have melanated skin, who really look like they are from a certain continent or a certain nation? Now, that's a bias too. Bringing in different families. I understand, people want to show that people can love each other for mixed races, but also there is a bias from not even having the same race together. Like I've seen a lot of African-American mixed race imagery going on. It's like, well, where's the African-American male loving the African-American female? That's and with their beautiful kids, with beautiful hair that's not just a straight texture. So there's all these things that are affecting the marketplace and how people are relating to what's happening. And I understand that. But when you have people who are on your team from different backgrounds, from different experiences, who have, oh my God, maybe even just experienced, a police officer, wrongly pulling them over just because they want to. When you have somebody with that kind of experience coming to the table, they are going to bring you a different perspective as you are designing and creating the next thing.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's sometimes it's those little things like we just said. You can see a picture on a website or hear a certain voice, and that can create a feeling about that brand or about that company right away. And to be thinking about it, especially we're in a world that's so global, but even in the US alone, we have such a diverse population. We're not a country that has the same types of people. So it's important, and I'm glad that you brought that up as well. Where would you like to see, again, we're talking more conversational AI, but you can even speak to tech in general, go in terms of removing bias, kind of what you'd like to see more of in the future? Anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, it would be great to have inclusion. It would be wonderful. There are so many people who are programming and have these great ideas and who are coding and, coming up with wonderful ideas, but yet they're not heard. It seems as if we're only hearing from the same types of people and programmers and coders and data scientists. And let's just face it, there's a lot of bias there, and some would even say racism. So those of you who are in that world, again, I'm really encouraging you to think differently and think how you can be more inclusive. And if you're like, oh, LaTonya, we just can't find anybody. My goodness, how many times do I hear that? Well, you look different. You got to look somewhere different. And, really to me, that's not the good answer from people who are solving some of the world's most difficult tech challenges. It's like, really, you can't find other humans who have similar interests in you? Well, maybe you need to do a little research, get some new friends, and don't put it all on them. Read some new books. There are a lot of books that are out here now that, well, they've always been there, but that people are reading. They're on bestseller lists. Try something different to expect something different. And do not keep using this excuse of like, oh, well, we just don't see anybody. Well, if you don't, then I would like to challenge you to do better, because you can. You're smart. You solve problems. And if you want to do something bad enough, you're going to do it.
Yeah, I agree. I love your energy and your passion, and just some actionable tools too that we can take. If people want to connect with you, they want to learn more, where's the best place to do that, LaTonya?
Oh, that would be super. And I would appreciate it if they did that. So I am on social media at the UB Trainer. So the U and the B stand for unconscious bias. So on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Pinterest, and LinkedIn, you can go to at the UB Trainer. And the is the word THEUB, and trainer, like you're working out. And so that's what I want you all to feel today. I want you to feel that burn as if you had a personal trainer talking to you today. So, sometimes you're like, oh my God, I know this is hurting me, but it's going to feel better tomorrow or the next day or the day after that. So that's what's happening with me as the unconscious bias trainer. I try to present things in a way that people can hear it and consider it and actually change. And to that point too, I do have a weekly blog. So if folks want to go to my website, www.theubtrainer.com, that is also a way to connect.
Perfect. And like we mentioned earlier, you have so much of this technical science background as well. And now adding this into it is just an added bonus. So I thank you so much for being here today, LaTonya, and all the great work that you are doing.
Thank you for having me, Carrie. We got to do this again. It was fun.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much all for listening and watching. Don't forget to subscribe to our Reed Speaker AI YouTube channel for all of our other video interviews, as well as our podcast, Creative and Tech, wherever you listen to podcasts.